Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I was looking back at the preamble for this plenary session as it is in the book, and it talks about the waves of technological change that we're seeing in diagnostics and precision medicine, and about the constant evolution of as well regulatory changes and reimbursement or financial system changes. We have got an outstanding panel here, which I'll let them introduce themselves, but we really have the full spectrum of leaders of organizations in this industry to talk about what they think is the most important priorities, changes, and challenges for 2017, and looking ahead into 2018. The format for the panel, we will have each of the speakers introduce themselves, like name, title, and association, so that you in the audience know who you're looking at. And then we will come back, and from this side to the far side, we will have each panelist give a 3 or 4 minute discussion of what their organization sees as the big opportunities and big challenges in 2017 and looking ahead into 2018. So with that, let's start by each of us just introducing ourselves, and then we'll come back and have each short presentation.
Good morning. I'm Lee Carrington, substituting for our Office Director, Alberto Gutierrez. I am the Director of the Division of Immunology and Hematology Devices in the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics.
Mary Williams, Executive Director of the Association for Molecular Pathology.
Hi, I'm Julie Connie. I'm the President of the American Clinical Laboratory Association.
Good morning, I'm Andy Fish. I'm Executive Director of AdvaMed DX, which is the trade association representing manufacturers of diagnostic tests.
Good morning, I'm Michael Bennett. I'm actually a professor of pathology at the University of Pennsylvania. You can see my day job in the actual description there, but I'm here as president of AACC.
Good morning again. Len Lichtenfeld, Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society.
All right. Mary, your organization has been very active, and I think it's fair to say increasingly active the last several years on policy issues and industry-wide issues for stakeholders. What do you see as the big advances of the last year and the challenges for the year ahead?
Well, specifically for policy?
Well, in the field of things that happen in Washington, or things that Washington can affect.
Absolutely. A lot of the things we were just talking with one of our members, we're only 23 years old at AMP, and so it's a new field. We were founded with a bunch of molecular diagnostics professionals getting together and say, how can we do this and how can we shape this field and do this better? And they're still doing that. And so ensuring that on a technical basis that tests are high quality, and to make sure that the tests make, on a medical sense, that makes sense for patient care. And so that's how it all started, but then we started to realize that there are opportunities and challenges policy-wise. And so in the last few years, we've been very active in advocating for patient access to appropriate testing. So that's a nice soundbite, but it's of course very loaded. It has things to do with ensuring that that there's a regulation that makes sense. So we have a proposal that's for CLIA modernization. We feel that there are already processes and systems in place, but that can ensure and reassure patients of the quality of the testing that they're getting, and to even beef up and raise the floor of the regulation of laboratory developed procedures. And then also we want to ensure transparency. So one of the things in our CLIA modernization proposal is about transparency, so that the ordering physician and the patients know more about the tests that they are receiving, the assays they're receiving. On the other side, then, we also are very actively involved in the economic affairs side of things. So that's coverage and payment. So that seems a little bit funny for a 501c3. We're not a trade association. We're a bunch of molecular professionals. We're a bunch of medical professionals, right? But patients don't get appropriate access to care when there is not appropriate coverage for testing. We spend a lot of time in responding to draft LCDs. We now work with private payers to help understand what they need to make appropriate coverage and payment decisions, and so that we can have a dialogue. It's been very, very effective, particularly in this last year, is a dialogue with private payers.
Excellent. Julie?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and also with my fellow panelists. I like what Mary spoke about working about access for patients, and I think as we talk this afternoon, you'll find that we agree on some things and we disagree on other things, but I think all of us are really working towards that goal. ACLA priorities for this year are twofold. I've been at conferences with many of you, and you've heard me talk about PAMA a lot, and I continue to talk about PAMA a lot. I know that there was a session earlier today. So ACLA's top priority right now is implementation of the clinical lab fee schedule provisions of PAMA, and actually delay of PAMA to allow continued reform to get that legislation, or excuse me, that statute where it needs to be and where Congress intended it to be, and that's the development of a market-based system that does allow, in fact, that continued access to patients. A little background on that. When that legislation was enacted, ACLA was supportive of the provisions, and that was for a couple of different reasons. The first was that it repealed the Technological Adjustment Authority by CMS. That authority gave CMS the ability to cut any test by any amount. So what we were looking at was really just broad across-the-board cuts without a lot of rhyme or reason to them. So what PAMA did, it repealed that, and it's instead put in its place the concept of applicable laboratories reporting their private payer rates to CMS, and the development of a weighted median that would set the prices for those tests. Sounds like a good idea, market-based, allowing for innovation, allowing for that broad scope of the market, hospital labs, independent labs, and physician office labs coming together, to develop those prices. And there have been certainly positive steps along the implementation pathway. We've had a good partnership, I think, with CMS in getting many aspects of PAMA kind of up and running and ready for that system. But there's a fundamental issue with PAMA, and the reason why the ACLA board has elected to call for delay and reform is, but for a very small minority of tests, we're not looking at market-based pricing. So that minority of tests that I mentioned, some very, very important tests, these are, for the most part, single source tests, if you will, one laboratory offering a test. If you've got one lab or a small handful of labs offering a test, you're getting the market pricing. You're getting that information to set that market-based price. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of tests, the system that CMS has set up has prohibited the vast majority of the market from providing their data. So by the HHS Office of Inspector General's own estimate, virtually no hospital labs will provide any data. A minority, actually, of independent labs will provide data, and the vast majority of physician office labs were prohibited from providing data. We're expecting to see those weighted median rates, those proposed PAMA rates in September, rates finalized in, final rates published in November, implementation in January. What ACLA has worked towards and partnered with many of the folks at this table is delay to allow time to get this right. You're not going to have a market-based system based on the exclusion of the vast majority of the prices. So that's really, really a key focus of ACLA. The other issue I'll touch on briefly, I don't want to take up too much time, and I'm sure we'll get into it in our discussion, is the regulation of laboratory-developed tests. ACLA believes that a legislative solution is necessary to update the regulatory framework, and that Congress should look to develop that framework that is a regulatory pathway for both IVD test kits and laboratory-developed tests. I think an important note in ACLA's positioning, and one that is sometimes misunderstood and has had some evolution. ACLA very strongly opposed the FDA's proposed guidance to regulate LDTs as medical devices. We fundamentally believe that LDTs are not medical devices, and that the FDA does not have the authority to regulate LDTs, in fact, because they aren't medical devices. However, the announcement of last year that the FDA would not finalize that guidance, I think we see that as a real opportunity. There's an opportunity now to work with Congress to develop a framework that allows those innovative tests to come to the market, that avoids duplication, that lets CLIA continue to do the good work that it does on laboratory operations, strengthens CLIA, and creates a category of LDTs that potentially would be reviewed by the FDA. So I'll stop my comments there and look forward to the comments of other panelists and your questions.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Christina and the conference for convening this panel and having me here. I'm really pleased to say that we've worked with all the individuals on this panel and the organizations they represent for years, and are really pleased to have a collaborative approach to issues, even when we don't agree on the policy prescriptions at hand. We're all in this field together as a broader community of diagnostic stakeholders, and so I think it's really important to continue these dialogues and to foster these relationships. I'm just going to make, I guess, 3 quick points about our agenda overall. First of all, our vision is of a world in which healthcare systems fully leverage diagnostic tests to improve patient outcomes and advance public health. There's a lot of dimensions to what that might mean, but of course here in Washington we focus on 2 key policy areas that you've already heard people talking about, which is regulation of diagnostics and then reimbursement of those tests and delivery issues in the healthcare system. So just briefly on those 2 core policy areas, of course, we've been very involved in the regulatory debates around not just LDTs, but of course regulation of manufacturer-developed tests as well. And we've long advocated for a unified, consistent treatment of all tests based on patient risk, regardless of who manufactures those tests. I'm not going to say a lot about this issue right now. I'm assuming we're going to talk more about it during panel discussion, but we're very engaged in that ongoing debate. We're pleased to be working closely with ACLA and other stakeholders and patient groups like American Cancer Society with Congress as committees and offices on both sides of the Hill continue to look at possible legislative solutions to this longstanding debate. On the payment front, we're equally concerned around the potential negative effects of PAMA. As Julie explained well, and like ACLA, we also supported PAMA in its overall scope. We didn't advocate for that market-based approach, but we advocated for a lot of the things we thought would flow from that number, and as Julie said, avoiding worse outcomes. We really felt that there were very credible options on the table that would have resulted in deeper cuts. But of course, it's important to get PAMA right, as Julie explained, and also PAMA, because it's not an across-the-board cut, will have a more disruptive effect, have a differential impact across a myriad of labs depending on their test mix and current reimbursement rates. So, we're very concerned and trying to work very closely with our customer and our ACLA on PAMA implementation. So I just wanted to mention briefly another aspect of our work, and this goes back to something Mary said about working increasingly with private payers. We've been really cognizant for a while that our manufacturers, despite some hurdles at FDA, by far their biggest problem is getting traction with payers and with health systems and figuring out how to best assess and communicate the value of their tests in a world in which there's an increasing demand for evidence, sometimes unrealistic expectations about what evidence is really needed. But any way you slice it, our manufacturers, all test developers really, whether you're a manufacturer or a laboratory, are under increasing pressure to demonstrate the value of their tests and to demonstrate the value of that test to a range of stakeholders, right? So our manufacturers may only have one purchaser at some point, but they have to demonstrate value to a range of stakeholders or constituents or really even customers, in a sense, for their tests. So we undertook a long project and developed what we've called a diagnostics value framework. And I won't go on and on in detail about it, but I would encourage you to go to our website and look for it. We developed a value framework. We developed several case studies showing how to apply this value framework to specific tests. And the bottom line is this is a tool that's intended to help any test developer better assess and communicate the value of their diagnostics and think comprehensively about how you talk about the value of that test to a payer, how you talk about that value of test to a clinician, to a patient, to a health system, and really think through that range of constituents and what kind of evidence you're going to need to bring forth to make that value case. And ultimately, we're hoping to encourage all test developers just to think about that value case long before you're even in R&D, right? Look ahead to the kind of questions that somebody's going to ask you and what kind of case you need to make to get commercial traction. And if you can't answer all those questions and you don't have a plan to answer those questions in a timely way, then you may get through FDA or put yourself on the market through a clear process and find out that you're spinning your wheels and not getting where you want to be. So we've really focused our efforts on expanding our advocacy and this kind of work around value to the private payer world and to health systems, and we're continuing to build up a program to reach out to and try to influence private payers in the way others think about the value of diagnostics. I'll stop there.
Okay, so it's clearly reimbursement is the big issue that's keeping everybody awake at night at the moment. So AACC, of course, is sort of represents almost everyone in lab medicine in this room, from so doctoral level scientists through clinical laboratory scientists through the point of care individuals, and the IVD company. We partner with IVD companies, so it sort of makes it rather difficult when we have our board discussions relative to some of the issues that we're dealing with today. But certainly in terms of PAMA, I actually noticed for the first time last week, I actually sign off on the cost for developing new tests, and this is an LDT test. And for the first time ever, there's a little line in the charge sheet that says PAMA. And it said NA at this point, but it worries us. It really is a concern. And like Julie mentions, I think really we need to get our acts together. I think by delaying so that the big academic medical centers, many of whom I don't believe have actually provided any data at this point, should get their acts together, because overheads are very, very different. You know, at my institution, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a little while ago, they separated two conjoined babies, conjoined at the head. Can you imagine, the cost of that process, the overheads that go into that are huge. They're very, very different to what you might see in one of the big private providers. So we do need to get our acts together and sort of build our own sort of costs in. And sure, whatever comes back, but at least we need to have the debate as to, what is true value. ACC is also basically very concerned about the identification of the laboratorians in general. For the most part, laboratorians are not seen. And we are advocating at the moment for government to recognize that this is a group of individuals who actually are a significant part of the healthcare providing team. And that actually falls back on everyone in this room. If we're recognized for the testing that we do, it also sort of has an impact on the IVD companies who can now sell us those tests because they're recognized. And I think it really is a sort of a big deal. I have a lab that does nothing but LDTs. 2 years ago, I was quite worried about that because I don't have the resources to go through the FDA to get any of those tests. They're small volume tests that none of your companies would be actually vaguely interested in developing. But they actually do impact childhood care. We're working with rare genetic diseases in children. Some tests, we only do one test a week. There's no market for the IVD company. But we actually jump through the hoops to make those tests at least clear appropriate. So we do actually jump through a lot of hoops to make those LDTs appropriate for the market that we have at the moment. But we are concerned as to what might happen when LDTs come down the line at some point.
Well, I'm sort of the odd duck out here on this panel, and I'm not quite sure how to even respond to all these wonderful comments because I'm not a policy person, I'm not a laboratorian. I will share with you in disclosure that I spent 24 years on the RUC, and for those of you who know anything about physician payment, that's a privately based committee that helps work with CMS, but I'm not responsible for the lab fee schedule, so I'll stay out of that one. But clearly I represent an organization that has a great deal of interest in what happens to patients with cancer, an organization that supported a substantial amount of research to the tune of $4.5 billion and north of that, and is going to double its research budget over the next number of years. Because we want to see the fruits of everyone's labors brought to the care of patients in the quickest way possible. At the beginning of this discussion, the comment was, well, what's happened in 2017, what do you see going forward in 2018? And my vision is a much more global vision than what's been discussed so far. But clearly, I think it's no secret that we at the American Cancer Society did in fact support FDA regulation and oversight of laboratory-developed tests. And I'm deviating from my comments here that I had written out beforehand. I will share with you the reason for that was we wanted to make sure that the tests that got to the patient really made a difference, and then we had some ability to rely on the results of those tests as being accurate. Now, with Dr. Bennett sitting next to me, what I would say is a world-class laboratory, and among people sitting in this audience that are world-class laboratorians, I admire what you do, and I appreciate what you do, and I trust what you do. Unfortunately, not everyone in this space is represented in this room, so there was very real concern, and I assure you that as time goes on, as others probably on this panel are aware, the American Cancer Society is going to be remaining very, very much engaged. But one of the other issues in the comment, the word value came up. And as someone who, once again, has a much more universal view of the world than just the lab, I'm sure many of you share that universal view. I don't want to sound like I'm saying that you don't. The word value is important because healthcare resources are finite, and we have to make sure that what we do makes a difference. And just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it or have to do it. It means that what we should be doing for every patient under our care to make sure everyone has access to care, that everyone has access to the highest quality care, is to be certain that when we say this is important, it really is important. Unfortunately, one of the comments that I make frequently, and I'll make it again today and I'll make it again tomorrow, is that the technology that you're bringing to the table is really dramatic and really important. However, what I call the application science, that is the ability to tell whether or not that technology makes a difference, lags behind. And sometimes the technology gets out ahead of the application, and I think that's in fact a problem. And it's a problem because people end up having to pay for it, people don't know what to do with it. We're moving down a path right now, today literally, and I don't want to review sources, but things you'll be hearing about in the very near future. Again, you may know about this in tumor-related DNA, circulating DNA, and the importance of that as an early detection test. And we will get there. There's no question in my mind, nor has there been a question in my mind for a number of years that we will get there. The question in my mind is when we get there, will we know what to do with it? Will it really make a difference? Will we pick up cancers that otherwise would not be problematic? So I think in summary, the reality is we have to be judicious. There will be more regulation and oversight. The payers are swamped with new requests coming in the door that they're having difficulty evaluating. I know that in the CMS side, they're trying to wrestle with this. People here are much more familiar than I am with all the intricacies. But at the end of the day, it has to be about the patient. It has to make a difference. It has to have credible evidence. It has to be hopefully reasonable costs, although some technologies, including treatment technologies, are reaching costs that we never dreamed of before, and we will have to figure out new innovative ways of paying for that. And we will find ways to keep innovation alive. But innovation to just say, I can do it because it's different, is no longer going to carry the day. Health systems and everyone else are going to demand that when you offer them something and you offer the result, that that result has meaning and that that result is trustworthy. So with that, I'll turn this back to the chair. Thank you.
Leonard, thank you very much for that closing. We placed you toward the end of the panel so you'd have the chance to comment and bring the patient's perspective, and you did a very good job of doing that.
Thank you.
Leah, let me ask you a question. The FDA has a new leader this year, Scott Gottlieb, who probably many people in the audience have heard speak at some point because he was a frequent speaker at cancer and other panels over the last 5 or 6 years when he was out of government. So he's sort of a known quantity to the industry and the community. The FDA has many initiatives in diagnostics. There are new things in point-of-care tests. There have been new approaches to approving genetic tests, with some of the approvals coming out for 23andMe, but then shared by the rest of the community. FDA just approved the first multi-gene cancer panel test this summer. There'll be several of those probably by the end of the year. What's perspective do you think the FDA sees as the important initiatives now?
Well, first of all, FDA's mission is to make sure that we provide to the community safe and effective devices, and that patient care is forefront in what we do. As a part of that, and as a part of the 21st Century Cures, over the last few years, FDA has cleared or approved 36 companion diagnostics and therapeutic pairs, a total of 26 companion diagnostics, 17 cancer therapeutics, and 11 molecular markers. And that is coupled with something that it is more relevant to my particular division, the Division of Immunology and Hematology, the 23andMe. So there has also been an establishment of an oncology center for excellence that is interaction between the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research as well as the medical devices, CDRH. We also have opportunities, as always, for innovation. I know oftentimes FDA is considered more of a barrier rather than somebody who reaches out. And one of our pushes for innovation has been outreach, both to the patient community as well as to industry and manufacturers. But we still need to provide what we think is sound and science-based evidence for our clearances and approvals. So there we still seek in every type of approval or clearance to have valid analytical and clinical performance characteristics for any device that is cleared in the Center for Devices. And so we continue to try to reach out to industry, manufacturers, other agencies to make sure that those devices that are going to market are safe and effective.
Leah, I think one of the things that people in this community really appreciated about the FDA over the last 4 years or so, there were a number of, they may have appreciated the LDT regulation a little less. However, I think what people did appreciate, there were a number of open workshops on next generation sequencing, how the FDA could retool itself to face next generation sequencing. The FDA would put out white papers for public comment, clearly was reviewing the comments. Last summer, 12 months ago here in Washington, the FDA and the AACR, American Association for Cancer Research, had a full-day workshop with about this many people, maybe more, on how FDA was approaching liquid biopsy tests in cancer, with the Roche Cobas test as the centerpiece for that day. But all of those were things where the FDA was being very open about talking about its thought processes and seeking input for the community, which is exactly what you just mentioned. Could you touched on something briefly, which is the Oncology Center of Excellence. As long as I've been sort of tracking the FDA for maybe 10 years, the FDA's talked about having the diagnostic people collaborate with the drug people, and Elizabeth Mansfield talked about that from her office. And then 21st Century Cures has a specific section endorsing and encouraging the FDA to have these centers of excellence, which are by definition interdepartmental, or to bring the silos together. Could you tell a little more about how that's actually rolling out at the FDA to bring diagnostics and drugs, the staff together under this umbrella called Oncology Center of Excellence?
Well, the Oncology Center of Excellence is basically based not within any particular center, but rather a conglomeration of different participants throughout the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, as well as participants from the Center for Devices and Regulatory Health. They meet regularly to discuss new innovations, new drugs, new device technologies, application of next-generation sequencing, application of other tests that have also come into the agency. It is a work in progress, so I don't have a lot of details precisely on exactly where they stand right now, but I call it more of the virtual, not necessarily located at any particular center, but certainly with interaction between the multiple centers where a drug or a device may be in combination. I think over the years, the companion diagnostic has been thoroughly vetted and worked out in many cases, but as the technology evolves, we have to then look at our processes and make sure that they are relevant and valid for the new technologies that may be coming available, as well as new drugs that may be entering the space.
I have a question for the panel in general. One of the trends I've noticed in the last year, we hear about consolidation in the lab industry, or labs buying other labs, or hospitals selling off their labs to an outside entity. But there have also been a number of spin-out laboratories. So Mount Sinai has spun out a lab called Semaphore. Intermountain has spun out a cancer genomics lab. Roswell Park has a spin-out lab called, I believe, OmniSeq. There may be several others as well. And one of the things that I've noticed in these is that, especially Intermountain, which I have no contact with, I just read about it, they seem to be offering, broader services than we ever thought of a laboratory. So, here's where you can get your genomic sequencing done through this Intermountain Spinout lab, but it's also a place to go for telemedicine genetic counselors, and it's also a place to go for a virtual tumor board, and it's also a place to go, they will help align you to clinical trials nationally, unrelated to their parent. They will also have a service on their website. They say they will help get you the targeted drug that might be off-label, but that your genome is pointing to it. How do, as associations for the lab industry, like AMP and ACLA, it seems like it's an interesting trend that some of your members may be involved in or facing.
It's certainly a very dynamic industry. You're right. I think there's a lot of changes. There's been
The mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I rarely am not heard. It's not typically a problem. So I don't have a lot to say in response. I guess only that it's certainly a very dynamic time. There are a lot of changes, and I think with the policies that you're seeing, that's likely going to continue.
Mm-hmm.
You hit on a really important thing about the consolidation. And of course, there's great business reasons for consolidation. But then there's also, one of the things that we think has been a particular challenge and that concerns us are things that are other than good business reasons for laboratories selling or for consolidating. And so one of the things, we wrote a perfect storm white paper, on talking about, when there's coverage and payment, when policies that have, or there are regulation policies or things that have unintended consequences of saying that, and particularly in academic medicine, because they don't have the infrastructure. They're just not set up to have a regulatory affairs department or to have a whole infrastructure on reporting, every laboratory test that they do. So that, what would happen if that laboratory, and we're all molecular all the time, so we think about molecular testing. And so what would happen if they said, we're going to forget this molecular testing here at, Ohio State. We're going to forget it here at Johns Hopkins. We're just going to go ahead and we're going to shut down our molecular lab. But our members have actually said that's a real potential for a consequence. So then we look and say, because we're all about patient care, what would be the potential consequence of patient care if Johns Hopkins stopped doing molecular testing, And so there's a shakeout there, not only in patient care, but for manufacturers, because I'm sitting in a room full of a bunch of manufacturers. If you had 5 customers instead of 300, what would happen to innovation? What would happen? So that's enormously disruptive in consolidation. But then you mentioned the spinoffs. And so those are the things that are very interesting. And so then when we look and say, are these guys that are the spinoffs, are they doing things that are medically relevant? Are they doing things that are technically of high quality? So those are the questions that everybody looks at and asks. And so it is something that when we say, what is the key thing there in those spinoffs, is the involvement of a highly qualified professional who is developing and interpreting those assays.
Can I jump into this conversation, because now I can give the rest of my talk that I had. I told you I went off the speech, and now I'll just go through the rest of it. I'm going to take I'm not sure if I'm hearing what's been said, but let me take perhaps a little bit different approach. Let's talk about disruption, and you use the word disruptive, but I'm going to use disruptors in this space. Because I don't know how many of you out there are disruptors, and I don't know how many of you out there are comfortable with disruptors, but the disruptors have come into your world, and I assume you already know that. And they've come into this world with low-cost genetics testing. It's available directly to consumers, that has been vetted by recognized laboratories and is considered to be well done. Now, you may not agree, but others say, yes, it is. And I'm familiar with a little bit more than familiar with one company. I have no personal or financial interest. But, and there are others represented here that I know are in this room. They get the test. Everybody in this country now has access to the full sequencing. They can get it. You just take the tissue, the ad's running on TV, you can see it from Watson. I happen to make the point. They can live in the country, they can send it where they want to send it. The company will process it. It'll tell you mutational burden in addition to the sequence. It'll tell you the available clinical trials. And yes, it may also help get you set up with those clinical trials. That's what people need. And as far as the molecular tumor boards go, my concern, and those of others I know who share them, is how many clinicians out there have a clue what the latest information is on the abnormalities that are being picked up in these tests, or the meaning of these abnormalities, so they need somebody to interpret them. That is a systemic and systematic service being provided of, I will tell you, I think of high quality. Now, there's a backbone to that. You don't just get clinical trials off the web and hand them out. You have to have resources to make them work. You have to have people to help make the connection. And if we don't develop this, and in closing, if we don't develop this approach, we have to find, we are now slicing and dicing down to single mutation tests to tell us how to treat patients. It's no longer cancer of the colon. Oh, this is cancer of the colon. Oh, it's cancer of the breast. No, it's subtype breast, subtype colon, sometimes subtype MSI. So you need different approaches and different ways that make sense, that deliver the service wherever that patient is, not only for clinical care, but also for clinical trials to rapidly advance. So from my perspective personally, and I would suggest organizations beyond the American Cancer Society agree, we need to move in this direction. I'm sorry if that's threatening to some, but this is disruption and innovation. This is what we're supposed to be about. And by the way, the cost of that service is substantially less than what other laboratories are offering in the market. And the quality is monitored and equally high, if not greater. So that's what we're talking about here, and I think that could be, if you view that as a threat, so be it. Some people view that as an opportunity and may account for what you're seeing.
Thanks, Leonard. One of the things you read about any serious illness, and also certainly cancer, is that for the patient that is suddenly confronted with an extremely confusing system. So you've got the piles of insurance and the piles of pre-authorization, you've got the different kinds of radiotherapy and the different kind of tests and the different kind of doctors and second opinions, as ACS knows. And a few of these labs, or if you even want to call them labs, are really this kind of new thing. They seem to want to bundle as much of this stuff like the genetic counselors and the tumor boards and stuff, so kind of a single shopping thing. And whether that'll work or not, I don't know, but the wheels are turning. People are saying, well, this might be a new direction to go in to solve that problem.
So can I say a few words? So essentially, AACC also don't think, just like ACLA and AMP, that we should be talking about medical devices for LDTs. I mean, that's for certain. What I think we're missing here, certainly next generation sequencing, new technologies, disruptive technologies do need to be evaluated. There's no doubt about that, and I think that is a target to going forward. The biggest concerns in clinical labs at the moment is that they've already got pre-existing LDTs, many of them. And if basically they all become medical devices, it creates many issues for the clinical labs to actually perform. So I'd like to ask a quick question. How many in the room here have had a baby? Could be males or females. Okay, so the very first blood test your baby got was an LDT. That little blood spot that they collected when baby was born and sent off to a screening lab was a lab-developed test, and it speaks volumes. So, but these are LDTs that have been around a long time. They've stood the test of time, and the concern is that they're going to get hit. You won't be able to diagnose a baby with phenylketonuria, and then you're going to fill mental institutions with children with signs and symptoms of phenylketonuria.
Bruce, can I make another comment on your observation of what's going on in the lab business? Because I actually think there's a broader either trend or a set of pressures that all test developers are needing to respond to at providers, which is the need to try to find more commercial value in what they do beyond the test result, right? And I think there's a huge challenge to maintaining proprietary value in a test result no matter how fast you're iterating your technology or how much sort of IP you've got around something, there's just a lot of competition in the diagnostics world to set up in a way that lots of people can kind of get to a result in different ways. And I think that we're seeing manufacturers as well trying to figure out how to add suites of services, additional program plus their product to continue to build more commercial value around just test results, right? And if you think about what's going on in digital health, for example, more and more companies looking to find value in aggregated data as well, right? So not only might you provide services around your results, like interpretation and other guidances and so forth, but increasingly companies looking to aggregate diagnostics information and find additional value that they can monetize in big data sets, right? So I just think that's a big shift in the way a lot of different kind of companies are looking to both provide value, but also get compensated in ways that get beyond commodity. And I think that's the big challenge in diagnostics, is how to not be commoditized.
I think that some of it's taking things we were trained in, and now it's just potentially writ larger in the modern healthcare system and with a more digital healthcare system. So when I was training in med school in the 80s and pathology in the early 90s, they emphasized in pathology, talk to the clinician, be available clinician, know how to help the clinician. That's what makes a great pathologist. And it still does, or a great laboratorian. However, in addition to that thing I was trained in, now we have, and refer them to the digital tumor board, or refer them to the telemedicine genetic counselor, or refer them to this big database that will organize clinical trials. So I guess you could view it as leveraging and amplifying that one-to-one relationship with these tools. We're down to a couple minutes. PAMA is interesting because it cuts across the whole laboratory industry. If you're genomic health, PAMA is important, and if you're a small hospital lab in Alabama, PAMA is important, and if you're a middle or big reference lab, PAMA is important. One of the twists in PAMA that people were just watching from a distance for a couple of years was PLA codes. PAMA says that or the MA and PAMA say that any lab-developed test or any FDA-approved test can get its own code. And nobody knew what was going to happen with that. But there were 17 PLA codes 2 weeks ago at the CMS pricing meeting. There were another 8 or 10 PLA codes in the hopper on the AMA's public agenda for August. That brings us up to 25 or 30. Do organizations like AMP and ACLA have any thoughts yet on PLA codes other than wait and see, which might be the appropriate thought or the reasonable thought?
I think, make sure I'm talking into the microphone this time. I think some of it is wait and see, Bruce. I mean, when you look at those codes for ACLA, we provided comment on one of them because it was an ACLA member and we could vet that through our CPT committee. But because many of these codes are proprietary, it's very difficult, I think. We were limited in our ability to provide that. And then how much they're really ultimately adopted and used. I think those are the questions, and we just don't know.
Should I just comment very briefly on that? We had actually pushed for those test-specific code provisions in PAMA, we had actually pushed for provisions that were in earlier versions of legislation that became PAMA, at least as far back as 2011, pushing for that kind of provision. And the reason we were doing that is because we felt that there was a real need to try to break up the broad categories in the CPT code set. And that as you increasingly had companies, whether they're labs or manufacturers, developing next iterations of tests or using new technologies and so forth, that you really had to have the ability to identify a specific test by a specific entity to be able to promote and capture additional value relative to other tests that might fall into the same CPT code, but might really be providing results and value that could be differentiated. So that was some of the original thinking around why those codes are even in legislation. So obviously a lot to still play out, but we're hoping that some of the results will be what we had originally pushed for.
So I actually think we're in a wait-and-see situation, but we need to be in a position to react when we do get data.
I know nothing about PAMA codes, but it has never stopped me from making a comment. I spent 25 years valuing CPT codes and physician services. I wish you well. I will tell you that we did value some of the molecular codes in broad categories. we had to put a single value based on certain characteristics, and you take evidence and reports from various organizations on the work involved, and even doing that was a difficult task. It drove me to retirement. So with that, again, don't take it lightly. It gets to be a food fight. There's a certain amount of money in the budget. I would assume it's going to be the same way, and you will thoroughly enjoy it. You will invest lots of resources and hope you can find people who say, I think this is fun, because they're few and far between. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we want to clear the table so the next panel can start on time in 2 or 3 minutes. Let's have a big round of applause for the panel.